We are so glad that so many of you decided to come see us. Okay, we know you only came for George, but we're really, really glad to see you. I'm Joellen Russell. I'm our new department head. Barbara has done an amazing job, and I'm just taking over. So I'm really glad that Cal and Maurizio managed to talk George into doing this. And there's been such a turnout, both online and in person. We're going to do it every year. So George, you're on the hook, you know? And I'm going to turn it over to Cal and Maurizio. Really, we owe them a huge round of applause because they have arranged an incredible series of colloquium speakers, and we're going to make them available on Zoom, et cetera, if any of our alumni want to come in. But particularly the beginning of every semester, please come. You're welcome. We love having our bigger community in our house. It's so wonderful to see everybody. All right, and I'm going to turn this over to Cal to do George's introduction. Now, it has to be at least 20 minutes. I mean, if you just
talked about that already. Thanks, Joellen. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad to see the turnout here. Thank you very much for showing up. And we know it's a lot thanks to George's magnetic personality, shall we say. I just want to start off with those of you who are registered in the class. If I could just see a raise of hands for those students who are registered as part of this class. Thank you very much. So next Tuesday, I believe, is our graduate student orientation. Mauricio and myself and maybe a couple others are going to explain to you just kind of the concept behind Colloquium, what we require you to do, and so on. We're not, so we do have a sign-in sheet, and we do make you do some assessments based on the talks that you see as part of the Colloquium. We'll get into that next week. We're not going to do that this week. So thanks for showing up, but we'll start the official sort of record for the class next week onwards. Okay. And I think that's about it for any announcements for now. Mauricio, were we good on that? Okay. All right. So without further ado, I'm on the clock here because I know George is going through a lot of material here. But so I'm going to do a very simple introduction for Dr. George Davis. I believe George got his bachelor's at the College of Worcester in 1966. Did I get that correct? 64, and 66 was a master's at the University of Texas at Austin, also where I got my master's and my PhD. I believe George worked a little bit on Guatemala for his master's, and then after that went on to get his PhD at the University of Michigan, working on sulfide deposits in New Brunswick. After that, George started as a faculty member here as an assistant professor in 1970. And went on to become a tenured professor here, I think in 76, if I'm not mistaken. And then eventually, I got to just stop myself here because he's basically served in every position here at the university that's conceivable, is what it seems like from his CV. So for the students, if you're looking for inspiration, I would definitely go to George Davis's page and take a look at all of the different things that he's done, which includes being the president of the University of Vermont for a short little bit. After which he came back to the university and served to the University of Arizona and served here from 93 onwards, and officially kind of toning down his capacity for various different things, which includes the academic provost and several other positions in 2008. Since 2008, George has been teaching here as part of our department and actively doing research here. And I just commented to him before about the really cool paper that he got published in GSA Memoirs with a lot of our students and postdocs over here. So active research going on metamorphic core complexes just in our backyard. Although this talk today is not going to be in our backyard, it's going to be in George's backyard, but not ours. So without further ado, please welcome George Davis as our first colloquium speaker.
Hey, thanks, Cal. And thanks to all of you for showing up for the talk. I proposed the talk as a start of the semester talk. I don't think there's any better time of the year for academics, for students, faculty, colleagues, than the start of a semester, because you're taking stock of your goals, what you'd like to accomplish, you're making choices, you're digging inward to figure out what you want to do in life. And I just think that at the start of each semester, we as a department should come together. And when I say department, that is a broad description, including our alumni and friends, and get together for an accessible, hopefully interesting talk, and then move into our Thursday afternoon colloquium research talks. I'm going to take you on a trip to Greece. Let me say, thinking about Kyle's introduction, University of Michigan, my PhD was earned there under the advising of Bill Kelly. And Bill Kelly passed away just 2 days ago at the age 94. Marilee and I, my wife Marilee and I, had a wonderful hour conversation with him on the phone about 2 months ago. And it was just a gift. And I think I'd like to dedicate this talk to William C. Kelly. But let's go to Greece. And I got to figure out where I can stand and sort of see what's happening. Maybe I'll start out over here so I can actually see and not.
You can move, but I got to follow the camera.
Oh, okay. And we're going to go to Mount Lecheon in the Peloponnesus of Greece. The view isn't bad. Look at this view. You know, on a good day, you can see 100 kilometers, you know, on a good day. And you see in the foreground here, can't you see in the foreground? If I can see the pointer, find it here. There it is. These column bases that prescribed an entrance to this very important sanctuary on the top of the mountain. And we know on good authority of Pausanias, a 2nd century Christian era traveler in the Greek world, who basically talked to everyone, took notes, went to all the major sites, and wrote voluminously on what he had learned and what he had seen and heard. And Pausanias makes it clear that on the top of the columns that were once here, there were gilded golden eagles. And the golden eagle is a symbol of our man Zeus. Here's Zeus on a coin that was one of the finds in the altar on the mountaintop. And on the right forearm, Zeus is carrying a golden eagle. And then over here, of course, his walking stick is a lightning rod. I mean, Zeus was Mr. Atmospherics. Marilee and I, on the very first expedition on the Mount Lecheon project in 2004, Marilee and I were both there, thanks to the leadership, whom I'll describe in a second. And the day that we left the mountain, we saw 2 golden eagles flying over the top of Mount Lecheon. It was pretty thrilling. This is thrilling as well. Look at a miniature hand of Zeus grasping what's left of a lightning bolt. One of the finds. It's about this big, a tiny miniature. I'm stalled out. We can fix that. There we are. So, the location of Mount Lecheon is right in the center of the Peloponnesus. We're about 22 kilometers from Olympia. Although if you want to drive to Olympia from Mount Lecheon, it'll take you about 2.5 hours. That's the nature of the road system in that part of Greece. It's really a statement on the topography and the ruggedness of the topography. Mount Lecheon has for eons been associated with Zeus. The atmospherics of Mount Lecheon and the epithets of Zeus include cloud gathering, the master of bright lightning, he who releases rain, the shepherd of the clouds, and it goes on and on and on. We'll be learning this afternoon that there, in the sanctuary of Zeus, there's an upper precinct and a lower precinct, separated by an elevation of just a couple hundred meters. Those working on the very top in the summer are commonly in hoodies. It's kind of cold up there. And those down there in the lower sanctuary are just in short sleeves or whatever. It's a special environment. Our leadership, David Romano. David, you got to raise your hand here. This guy sitting right here, raising his hand, David Romano. And by any chance, is Mary Viazzi's here? Mary's not here today, but let me tell you the backstory on how this project began. In 2002, 2003, somewhere in that era, Mary and David met at an archaeology meeting for the first time. They knew each other through the literature. They hadn't determined yet that they were both interested in Mount Lecheon. Mount Lecheon is the sanctuary site that in some ways, to me as an outsider, was kind of overlooked. you don't hear about it. And probably you don't hear about it, and maybe it wasn't worked on systematically for the longest time because there are no big temples and built structures. Rather, it's a big hillside. And it's clear that there's goodies there because early archaeology in the very beginning of the 20th century uncovered finds, bronze statues of Zeus and other things as well. And Pausanias records indicate there was a lot going on sometime back on Mount Lecheon. So Mary and David got together. They pitched a proposal to the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and they beat out UCLA. There's a very limited number of projects archaeologically that can be run in Greece from the United States every summer. And they came in first, and they got permission to basically begin a study that would include excavation. And now it's been 19 years. A sustained effort with renewals every 5 years. 4 years of excavating. You can only excavate 6 weeks per summer. Too much would come out of the ground. And the effort of Arcadia archaeology wouldn't be able to keep track of everything. And then you go for a renewal. Well, they've renewed and they've renewed and they've renewed. And it's extraordinary what they've been able to accomplish. At the time, David was a research archaeologist, a professor of research archaeology at Penn, and Mary was the head of our classics department at the University of Arizona. We subsequently stole David. Notice he's here. He's not at Penn. We stole him, and he's in the anthropology department doing good things, okay? Now, we geologists know, and I must confess that it must be true of almost every discipline that exists. When we have opportunities to do international studies, we become enriched culturally. And the Greek study has been no exception. David and Mary led us into Anacarias, this little village. And when we arrived there in 2004, so for the first summer, I think there were 39 people living in the village. Now, how many, David, are there? 6, 7, 8? I know there was a big vote that took place when we were there one summer, and some of the people who voted came in as family members from outside of Anacarias. The vote was 10-9, whether or not to stay within the European Union or not. 10-9. You think everybody's the same in this little Greek village. It turns out there was major polarization on that issue. But one of the beautiful things about the project has been living in Greece for short periods of time. Now, David and Mary, in order to make this all work, recruit each year probably 30 to 35 students, graduate students, some undergraduate students, some high school students, where they recruit professionals into the program in other areas, other fields, so that at any one time in the village, on the site, in the summer during the 6-week period, there may be 40 people there. And Marilyn helped cook for the masses a few summers, which was also a joy. And then what doesn't happen in our field of geology, because we're out wandering around solo, maybe a couple of people, maybe a field assistant, and we come back at 5 or 6 o'clock. When you're on an archaeological site, colleagues from around the world, colleagues of David and Mary and Irene and others, they come in, they say, what's going on? They want to see things. What do you do? What's coming out of the ground? So there's this sharing of intellectual content. And so Mary and David, in addition to their normal research, are giving guided tours and walking seminars during this period. A little tectonic framework to begin with, because the tectonics and the faulting in Greece are so important to understanding Mount Lecheon. This is a plate tectonic map, or at least it's a representation of active plate tectonics in this part of the world. Here's the Peloponnesus right here, the Peloponnesus. The Arabian plate is jamming into Anatolia. Turkey and the rest of Anatolia are being squeezed like a watermelon seed westward. And then there's a great sucking sound because the African plate is subducting underneath Crete and creating a tectonic suctional force that actually draws Southern Europe toward Africa, toward the subduction zone. And you can see this in these arrows. These arrows are velocity vectors determined through global positioning system geodesy. And you can see how the rates, here's the scale for velocities right here, 20 millimeters per year. If you like a smaller number, 2 centimeters a year, not 20 millimeters. No, it's not quite, that's a joke. And then you come along here and the tectonic suctional forces actually cause the velocity of southwesterly movement to increase to about double of what it is further to the north. Well, when that happens, stretching has to occur, ripping has to occur, and you see the Gulf of Corinth as one of the expressions. The crust doesn't stretch like a rubber band, does it? But rather it accommodates the stretching through faulting, and the faulting in each and every case releases energy, and the energy is what we detect as ground motion and earthquakes. And this would be an earthquake map for probably, these are epicenters of earthquakes, probably for only a 15-year period of time. What accommodates the stretching? Well, what we call, I just laugh about it sometimes increasingly as I get older, normal faulting, as opposed to abnormal faulting. Normal faulting. And normal faulting, it's almost like riding down a sliding board. That is, you're moving down a surface and becoming further and further detached from where you were. This is a little cartoon that basically describes the scene right here. And notice, nature is generous enough in depending on the rock types, to leave abrasion marks on the fault surface so that you can actually see the direction of slip of one block with respect to another, with respect to another. This is a fault surface in Greece. It's locally referred to as the mirror. The mirror, it probably is called that in Greece, but I don't know what the name is. And you can see here, what I love about this image, down here is an orchard, a little fruit orchard. It's the land surface, it's the block of rock on which these trees have been planted that has moved down with respect to the high country over here. This mirror surface probably represents 50 to 100 rupture events, earthquakes, slips over time. And in the aggregate over a period of time, this surface was created. Let's give some thanks to the Greece Highway Department. Decades ago, they came through, and apparently this surface was largely covered with cohesive, geologists here would know the term breccia, rock aggregate that was produced as damage during the faulting. The highway department said, hey, we can use this rock aggregate. Let's just pull it off, and just make some roads. And when they pulled it off, they revealed the mirror. And you can see the surface, this orchard, so to speak, didn't move straight down the fault. It moved with a little inclination. And we love that as structural geologists because it helps us determine something about stress directions. Now, there's a cartoon that gives you a little sense of how normal faulting works. And if the cat isn't so important, except as a backstop, but what is important is the length of this collection of books increases as a result of the slippage, the domino faulting of those books. Now, the place to be convinced that stretching is taking place is in the Gulf of Corinth at its narrowest width, right here, the Patras-Rion Bridge, which was completed, as I recall, in around 2006. And if you take your friends there to see it, don't just drive over the bridge, go under the bridge and take a look at these expanders. So the design and construction of the bridge was such that this bridge can keep pace with the plate tectonic induced spreading of the Gulf of Corinth. And look at that rate, 1.6 centimeters per year on that order. It's going to give some life expectancy to that particular bridge. And then down here in the subsurface, well, this is the subsurface here, below the Gulf of Corinth, we see normal faults. But we also see in this tan patch through here, this yellowish tan patch, that as the faulting occurs, space is created for sediments to be deposited. So while the faulting takes place, there's a location where new sediment can be added to the stratigraphic column. Now, here's the mirror. The site, what could be better? Thermopylae, where Leonidas and 300 Spartans took on the Persian army. And when they did this back in the day, what was it, 486 BCE, something on that order, there was just a 20-meter wide bench, like a wave eroded bench area in which the battle took place. Now, there's a tremendous distance between the base of the Arkitsa fault and where the sea is today. This is a LiDAR image that shows the details of those abrasion marks on the surface. Here's another example of a normal fault. It's a fault scarp. And this fault scarp was produced at Caporelli in the eastern part of the Gulf of Corinth. And I've drawn in a couple of little red arrows here that indicate when the bottom drops out, so to speak, there's a stretching that takes place in that horizontal direction as well. A couple more examples of this. The point is that there's this association in Greece of faulting and archaeology. And this is Mycenae, the home of Agamemnon. And as you walk toward the famous Lion's Gate entrance right here, someone like myself has to stop. It took me 45 minutes to actually enter the palace of Mycenae because I was seeing these abrasion marks. Look at the striation. I was seeing the broken, fragmented rock that the Greek highway department would love. I don't think they'd come in and take that. But how fortunate the defense walls were built up on top of a pre-existing scarp, creating a little less work. Let's not stop here. Oh, there's our friend Poseidon. We think of Poseidon, don't we, as the god of the sea? Most of us think of Poseidon as the god of the sea, and we think of that trident as a harpoon spearing things. Don't believe it for a second. I learned from Mary and David that in the ancient times, I mean, let's go way back to deeper time, Poseidon was the earth shaker. He's the one who created the earthquakes. In my personal theory, and David has heard me say this a lot of times, this is no harpoon. This is more like a tuning fork. And when Poseidon creates the earthquakes, it's like hitting a home run with an aluminum bat, or maybe a foul ball with an aluminum bat. The vibrations are sensational. And when we talk to people, next time you talk to someone and ask them, oh, you're from LA, did you feel that last earthquake? I didn't feel it, I heard it. It sounded like a train going by. I think that's what Poseidon was up to. That's his symbol. Delphi. Well, Delphi is located where it is in Greece because Zeus wanted to determine where the center of the world was. And he thought of the world as a frisbee shape. And so he sent two golden eagles up in the air. They collided in midair, and Delphi was built directly beneath the site of collision. This is the Temple of Apollo. In the cellar of the Temple of Apollo, we have the Pythia, the oracle, who was placed by men on top of a tripodal chair. And when a pilgrim would come by and ask a hard question, they would shout the question down to the oracle, and she would speak the answer back in tongues. Why in tongues? She's breathing ethylene, carbon monoxide, and other things that are coming out of the Delphi fault, right? And this occurred over generations and generations. Well, that's the introduction. Let's get on to Mount Lecheon. So a photograph, whoops, I didn't mean to hit that one. This is a photograph I took late one afternoon from the megalopolis, the city of several polises, megalopolis, at the base of Mount Lecheon. And you can see some stormy weather up there created by Zeus. This is the location of the ash altar, the only mountaintop open air ash altar in the Greek world. We're going to get there. You're going to come to understand what that is. I took liberties over here. Look at this, 2 times vertical exaggeration, just to hype the topography and the relief. But I just wanted to show how the ash altar area kind of stands up as a projection from the general base level of the plateau. And I also want to emphasize that David and Mary have determined that this Lecheon sanctuary site is a pan-Hellenic site. People came from all over the Greek world. And the final part of their journey, and you couldn't be faint of heart, is to come up the flank of Mount Lecheon to get up to the sanctuary proper. And thus what they brought with them to dedicate were miniatures, like that miniature hand of Zeus holding a lightning. You didn't make this trip with a piano. You know, you're not taking your piano up this particular mountain. Now, a little more this is my last bit of background on structural geology. We have normal faults and we have abnormal faults. And one of the abnormal faults is called thrust faulting. And thrust faulting isn't a response. So I've let the cat out of the bag, but thrust faulting is not faulting that accommodates extension and stretching. Thrust faulting accommodates shortening that's produced by compression. And so the net effect is to take an unsuspecting set of stratigraphic layers and cause them to override one another such that the original basinal area that might be hundreds of kilometers in width is shortened by half, producing what we call, well, we call them a lot of things, but they kind of piggyback over one another. So when I'm driving down I-10, maybe going to New Mexico, and I see this train going by and the train's carrying cabs of pickup trucks, you know who came up with the idea of saving money. Somebody who had taken structural geology, maybe at the University of Arizona. Hey, we can save some money if we use a little thrust faulting concept in stacking these things. Okay. Well, I went into that little deal because the major structure on Mount Lecheon is a big thrust fault, and only a tiny part of it is preserved today, but it's a very significant part of it. This fault is flat in its orientation. The rocks that happen to be sitting up here were part of a gigantic regional sequence of rocks that we can think of as once sort of up in the sky. They've all been eroded. And these are out of place by maybe 60 kilometers. There's been a big push and the rocks have been faulting in such a way that right near the top of the mountain, you have this expression of the thrust fault that I refer to as the Lykaion thrust. So imagine the pilgrims and priests and athletes working their way up the mountain somehow and eventually getting to the sanctuary of Zeus, Mount Lecheon. And that's right in this area. And that fault divides an upper precinct, the upper sanctuary, from the lower sanctuary right there. So it's not enough to get up to the general height of Mount Lecheon. It's essential to get up to this particular mountain. Yeah, that faulting took place 50 million years ago. So here's a view of the trace of this same thrust fault, nearly flat, dips about 10 degrees. This word klippa refers to an outlier, just a little remnant of rock that was brought in that allows us to say, man, there's more to the story than we might have imagined. And look how soft this topography looks. I think the ancient peoples recognized that, hey, this is different. It's not only kind of a dome-like mass, this tectonic klippa, but it also has a soft exterior, unlike most of the areas on Mount Lecheon and much of Greece that are sharp and raw because of limestone and the way that limestone weathers in that environment. And right on the tippy top of this piece is the ash alder, the mountaintop open air ash alder. Now, just to put some of this in perspective, my role on the project, you'll be surprised to learn, was the geologist on the project. And if you ask David and Mary, or if you would ask me, you'd get two different stories on how I came to be the geologist on the project. David and Mary might say, I might say that David and Mary asked me to join the project as a geologist. David and Mary might say, George volunteered to become geologists on the project. However it worked, I'm so glad it worked out that way. So when I started working there, one of the first things I needed to do was try to figure out the stratigraphy, the rock formations. This region had been mapped before at a very small scale. That is, a geologist covering a lot of terrain and mapping generally. That mapping was carried out in the 50s and the 60s. It was extremely helpful. And I needed to go to a little greater resolution. And I worked out this, oops, I keep hitting the wrong one. I worked out this stratigraphy, and I just referred to these units as like the thick white limestone beds. For a while, I referred to those beds as snow white. I didn't have any name for them, but they certainly stood out as a white folded mass. And to show you the strength and the role of thrust faulting, and here's the Lecheon thrust. Picture me walking up the side of the mountain, going through orange, brown, light green, dark green, gold, crossing a fault that is recognizable as a fault, and finding myself back in orange, brown, green, dark green, and this upper yellow has been removed by erosion. That's what thrusts do. They double up or triple up or quadruple up the crust of the earth and make it really thick and make it really buoyant, so that the land and the crust of the earth rises into what we call affectionately a mountain belt. And then the compression that created the thrust fault, look what it creates in the limestones, just these gorgeous fold structures. Now, you talk about folds. This is one of the big ones. This is one of the best ones. In the ABCs of geology, introductory geology, this is an anticline. It's perfectly symmetrical. And for scale, we have embedded in the apex of one of the layers a stockade, a defensive stockade, 3 stories high, that was built around 1815 during the Greek War of Independence. And this gentleman right here, who was someone who came to the village of Anacarias to visit with his brother, was approached by David, and David asked, hey, you know, there's a lot of talk about in the literature about the cave in which Zeus was born, the Zeus cave. There's some talk that Zeus wasn't born in Crete, but was born on Mount Lykaion, near a place called Cretea. And this guy says, oh, I was there when I was 10 years old. And I said, show me, take me there. And so he led me, and it's not easy to get to, but he was wearing his wingtips, you know, he's just like, what the heck? I'll take you there. And you kind of come in on some goat paths and you work your way up this weathered zone and you end up at this stockade. And I started thinking Eric Seedorf, saddle reef deposits and openings along folds and so on. And the man's name is Sevalakos. He took me there. And he says this is sort of a candidate for the birth cave of Zeus. Now, here's the backstory, thanks to David. If you go to the Mount Lekin website, you'll see every classical literature reference in ancient times on Mount Lekin. You'll see Virgil, you'll read about Virgil, who talked about the goats who would go up on Mount Lekin and they would get messed up in the briars, you know, and I know what rock formation these briars are growing on. And then they'd come down at night and they could hardly enter the barn, so to speak, because they were so tired and famished. But in this particular case, Pausanias writes, what you can read here, that some Arcadians, I like this, you kind of whisper it, some Arcadians call Mount Lecheon as the place where Zeus was reared. They claim that Crete's not the place, but rather the mother of Zeus, Rhea, gave birth to her son on some part of Mount Lecheon, and the place may be Cretea. That's the Cretea Ridge today. So that's the whole story. That is, Cronus was eating babies, you know, he was into that. And Rhea decided, I'm gonna basically fake it. I'm gonna wrap a rock in a blanket and have Cronus eat that. And Rhea brought in her friends who were in part musicians. They played a lot of music in the background so that Cronus couldn't hear the baby crying. And eventually Zeus survived as a baby and an infant and was raised on the flanks of Mount Lecheon. If David were here, he would also talk about the fact that the werewolf story began on top of Mount Lecheon, but that's another story. So this is the landscape that sometime back in the day, in the Bronze Age, incrementally became viewed as a good place to set up a spot where, and we don't know the frequency, those who were worshiping Zeus would come and gather. We won't spend much time on this, but I did want to tell you that I did my job. I mapped about 15 square kilometers in gory detail, and the objective was to see how each rock unit and structure connected with activity areas like the stadium and with the built structures like the bathhouses and so on. And standing out in red here, pardon me, is the trace of the Lecheon thrust fault. It figures so prominently. The ash alder is right here on the top of the mountain. The Temenos area, a spooky area. We'll talk about that in a second. David believes that the first running race stadium was right here along what might be an active normal fault. And then you drop down to the lower sanctuary here, where there's the only extant chariot racing track in the Greek world, Hippodrome. And the field is so small, relatively speaking, that rather than having a separate area for the stadium, both the Hippodrome and the stadium are combined in this flat area. There's a processional way, there's the bath, there's lots of things. So this geoarchaeological map attempts to sort of tie things together and show the intimate relationship between the two. I think it's a site that stacks up with almost any in terms of how the geology speaks to the archaeology and vice versa. So this is the draping of my geological map, some of the main elements on the landscape. And David Fisher, scientific illustrator here in Tucson, fabulous guy. For those who know my book, he's the one who does the cartoons in the book. So here's major fold structures ripping through the area. There's the Lecheon thrust. There's the ash alder on the top. This is the bathhouse. This is a collection of buildings that were central to the lower sanctuary. And then it's interesting and fun to think about, what did this area look like, say 3000 BC? And so David, you put together for me this combination of Google plus painting. The mist is in the background. Notice the mist in the background. And what we don't know, and what I'd love to do, going back in time, is to see what kind of vegetation was growing there. What were the woods like? Was there a forest? What was all that about? And then by the time we get to 300 BC, the scene is something like this in my mind's eye, based upon the placement of all of these built structures, which David has mapped over the years. The ash alder, the processional way. This ridge is beautiful. Walk up that gentle ridge. You come to the Agno fountain. Pausanias says the Agno fountain flows like the Danube, like the Danube. So he was at the Danube. This isn't the Danube. David and Mary say maybe the reference is that the Agno spring is reliable. It flows all year round. That's a good interpretation, I think. And then there's the Stowa, kind of an open air area, some mystical seats, another fountain or spring, and so on. This is a more general view of the layout in the lower sanctuary, the Hippodrome, the stadium, distinguished, the trace of the fault, and look at how all these built structures are compressed into the area of the trace of the fault, primarily because the water is seeping out of the fault to form springs. The bathhouse, we all have wonderful moments in our research. We also have some down moments. One of my wonderful moments was the day I realized, and Paul Damon of our department, the late Paul Damon would say, if it isn't true, it ought to be true. The bathhouse is right here. You draw a perpendicular line from the midpoint of the bath, and it carries up this hill, a little sunken area, and ends up at a sinkhole. I think the sinkhole was a source of the water that came down to the bathhouse. In the back wall of the bathhouse, you have these openings through which the water undoubtedly flowed. So there just happens to be a flat area in the Mount Lecheon area, and that's where this was plopped, the combination of the Hippodrome and the stadium. But don't think about it as a football field. It's 300 meters by 110 meters. I mean, it's a big scene. And the villagers and David and others over the years have found starting blocks made of marble, right? Marble, limestone, as well as corner posts on the chariot racing track, just to firm things up. That's what the Hippodrome looks like at ground view. And another cool moment, and this took not a moment, but years, trying to figure out why there's a flat area. It turns out this is for the geologist, a doubly plunging broad syncline that's aligned. Oh, I keep doing that. Come on, George. Oh, if I put out the lights, there we go. There's a synclinal basin that runs right through that area. And so the compressional stresses that created the faulting produced some folds, one of which is almost like a cradle. And in that cradle, silt and sediment accumulated, creating a soft surface for running. Now, David, when was this discovered, the stela? 1904. 1904, Koriniotis, archaeologist who first worked on Mount Lecheon, found this. It's a stone stela. It was for a time, maybe it's still there, in the village museum. It contains the names of the victors of the Lecheon athletic games, and David feels it was the games of 303, 304 BCE. You remember those games? They were streamed in, 303, 304, and it's a very helpful stela because the inscriptions carved into it showed not only the victors, and David knows the victors well enough to know that these same victors are named at Olympia. So these were athletes that were on the circuit, right? They were on the circuit. But it also describes what event they won, and it also gives their hometown, where they came from, Pan-Hellenic. They came in from all over the place, bringing their horses. Springs are pretty important if you're bringing your horses in. Well, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I've hit it hard. The fault goes around this lower sanctuary area. Here's a goat herd that's on, on the fault zone. The Stowa was built in such a way, think of it of walls and limestone compartments where people sold things and presented food. And this rock is so damaged and soft that I think whoever was in charge of things back at the time of the building of the Stowa, they knew they could just shovel the damaged material away and put that back of the Stowa anywhere. What's my time looking like?
20 minutes, 4:43.
Oh, great. All right. And then here's a spring that's right in the lower sanctuary, and the water is weeping right out of the fault zone. Why is that? It's because Zeus throws down the water from the clouds. The water makes it down through the mountain, through caves and fissures and fractures, and eventually it encounters the Lykaion fault, which I've drawn too steeply here. And the fault is full of clay gouge, damaged, and the water can't percolate through it. And thus it daylights on the side of the mountain. Upper sanctuary. We're finally getting to the upper sanctuary. And here's where I want to give you a little sense, a little flyover. If I can do that. There we go. We're flying right to the ash altar at this point. This is the Temenos area where the vehicle is parked. And you'll get a little sense of the students and others who are digging away in the ash altar at the top of the mountain. Off in the distance is the Temple of Apollo at Basai, about 5 kilometers away. That was designed and built by the same architect that built the Acropolis, built the Parthenon. The Temenos area, Pausanias says that if anybody who walks in there who's not a priest, when you go in there, you won't see your shadow and you'll be dead within a year. So we don't know what quite was going on there, but it is the border of that flat area happens to be a fault. From this area, most of the Peloponnesus can be seen. A major takeaway, probably the major takeaway in the study on Mount Lecheon that David and Mary have concluded is that there was uninterrupted Zeus activity from at least 1650 BC to 100, maybe 200 AD. And they've determined that because the ash altar, a blanket of ash maybe now 2 meters thick, We don't know how thick it was originally when the site was abandoned, but it was a windswept area. There's probably more of it. But in that bone ash, we're talking sacrificing animals, there were miniature vessels, coins, objects that were given to Zeus at the time of the sacrifices. And if you're an athlete, and if you're going to be boxing the next day, you might be saying to Zeus, give me some strength, tomorrow. And by the way, I want to pop this in for you. And so mixed with the ash are all of these finds, which can be dated. And out of that chronology comes a sense that this was a long, sustained, uninterrupted set of activities that you can't find, I don't think, in any other spot. Here's our first look at the ash altar proper. If we were there together, you'd reach in and grab the ash and it would be greasy. It's organic, rich bone ash. You sieve it and you find bone fragments, almost all of which are from femurs. The occasional kneecap fragment, the occasional tailbone fragment, it's almost all femur. So when you read the Iliad, the big celebration by the Greeks, hey, let's give Zeus the femur. I don't know whether he wanted the femur or not, but that's what they gave him. You don't find any evidence on the mountain so far for where the animals were slaughtered, but you go in there and you have sheep bones and goat bones and other animal bones that were from animals that were being sacrificed there. There's been the discovery of it clearly is a man-made platform. These rocks have been set into place as opposed to the bedrock right here, the fractured bedrock that's become more fractured because of the fires. And there's even prehistoric pottery found of Neolithic age. Art Rohn, in the first years, was the main man excavating. Terrific person. And that was near the start of the project. There was a day, I think it was in summer of 2006, when this was pulled out of the ground. And one of the joys of working in an archaeological project, really team-based, as I said, at 1 o'clock or so, people gather, 1:30 in the afternoon, you gather in what we euphemistically refer to as the dining palace. We go into the dining palace and we're all kibitzing with one another. What did you discover? What did you work on? What were the problems? And Art Rohn pulls out of his pocket this thing, which is a lentoid seal, crystal seal with the impression of a bull. And the archaeologists and classes jumped all over it because this is a 15th century BCE object that somehow made it to the top of Mount Lecheon, maybe from Crete. And up until that time, I may have this slightly wrong, but I think most of us were thinking, most of the archaeologists and classes were thinking, maybe that activity of worshiping Zeus began in about 700 BC. Not this. And how did Art find this? Art was, you'd hope he would be fastidious. And so at the end of a given day, before going to the dining palace, he would clean out the trench and he would put a tarp down. It might rain that night. Zeus might bring some rain. Next morning, they come up there with a crew. They take the tarp off. In the corner of the trench, there's this little pile of stuff, dirt, and there was a gopher hole. And so he screened it. He collected that gopher dug dirt, screened it, and found that. And so I hope that the gopher is in the acknowledgements. Kylixes, wine vessels. These folks would not only eat meat up there, but they would drink. And analyses have been done of the residue in these kylixes. It's all the same for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They were hooked on red Retina wine. And then there's Zeus again. That's actually a better image of Zeus and the golden eagle and the lightning bolt and the hand of Zeus. And just relatively recently, in the last, maybe these were found two summers ago, the hand of Pan playing a flute. I did some excavating, believe it or not. I persuaded David and Mary, could I dig a paleoseismic trench to see if there's an active fault right along the ash altar? And within 2 hours, I'm finding things. I'm not finding faults necessarily, but I'm finding objects. And I remember David, I said, David, what do we do now? And he thought about it. He's a thinker. And he said, you can proceed, George. And he says, he knows me too well, go slow, go slow. And he gave me this beautiful archaeological American field school notebook. And suddenly I became someone who's excavating. And I was thinking last night, as I was still working on this talk, the mapping, I adapted to the mapping quickly, as you would hope. But then I realized last night, we're mapping a volume. We're not mapping geology on a surface. Geologists map geology on a surface, unless they're working in the petroleum industry. And then we try to visualize what's down below. But in this case, you're actually incrementally mapping a volume of material. And I kept track of it through many devious ways. Look at the ash that's embedded in these blocks. This is what I excavated. It was talus, it was scree, big blocks of limestone. And I eventually got down to bedrock. And above the bedrock, there was paleosol. And on the top of the paleosol, there were finds. There were archaeological finds. You could just imagine people back in the day sitting on the slope of the hill and doing their thing and leaving their thermos bottle behind, or their water bottle, or whatever. And then I created these at College of Worcester. You were right. I went to Worcester. My senior thesis involved a lot of three-dimensional geometry, including orthographic projection. And I went old school and created these diagrams of proceeding from the top of the scree pile down to the bottom. And then I created, oops, I went too far, this cross-section, which indicates the locations of what they call baskets that have been removed and the locations of the finds within that basket. Turns out it's a collapsed wall. There might have been a buttress to keep all this ash from moving down slope in the old days. And it became overwhelmed. Maybe an earthquake helped it fall down. And it crashed over the side. And it buried some of the finds that were already on the hillside. And then more were added. So, do I have a few more minutes, or should I knock it off? 7 minutes, perfect. So the latest chapter, and this is a chapter for which a number of us are involved. Our own Susan Beck. Susan, I saw Susan back here, I think. Our own Susan Beck, seismologist, we dragged her in. Let me first say, why are we dragging people in? We're trying to figure out, why did Zeus worshipers keep returning to Mount Lykaion? Was it because, oh, they love thrust faults, you know? What was it about? Was it the scenery? You know, was it the high peak? No. What was causing it? And our working hypothesis is that the mountain resounds in dynamic expressions of natural forces, earthquakes, ground motion, lightning, thunder. So the experience is visceral. That's the experience. It's visceral. It's powerful. You know, there's some power there, and you keep coming back for more. Ken Cummins is here. Where's Ken? Ken's here. Ken is, I mean, he's done everything from electrical engineering to neurosciences, but he's a lightning guy, and he's with the Department of Atmospheric Physics. He's a lightning expert. And he's on the project, and his good colleague, Ryan Sayed, who's in Colorado working for the U.S. Lightning Center, is on the project. And there's a return of Pam Jordan. Pam Jordan was architect on the project with a team measuring and describing and drawing countless building stones. She's now a sound expert, University of Amsterdam, her PhD. She works on the psychology and the science of sound. You see where this is going. And my part is trying to make the argument that there's some active faulting in this area. There certainly is right around the corner, but here at the ash altar, notice this scarp line right here, along which there's all of this scree. I think periodically there's slip and there's accumulation of scree. A really nice example is this one. Here's the proto-stadium, the most ancient stadium where running races were taking place. We know as geologists that two formations abut here, there has to be a fault. And once again, there's a little area of a basin that opens up where sediments can accumulate. So when I, for example, walk across that proto-stadium, you know, in the summer, you realize how soft and wet it is, just perfect for a track. And then Susan provides this and says ancient peoples near the Lecheon peak would have felt earthquakes with magnitude 6 and over generated anywhere in the Peloponnese, as well as ground motions from larger, more distant earthquakes. And then we move into thunder and lightning. And Ken has spent a great deal of time thinking about and constructing diagrams which indicate, which describe the viewscape from Mount Lykaion. So when you look in every direction of the compass, how far can you see? Where are the obstructions? And so the idea is, how far away can lightning be observed from the top of Mount Lykaion? So that when people were there and are there now, you see way off in the distance that something's going on, Zeus activity. But it works the other way as well. When lightning is striking the top of Mount Lecheon, people that are a long way away look up and say, there's Zeus, at it again. And so Ryan and Ken pull together this extraordinary data that helps us that describes frequency of lightning strikes in the world. And when we take a look at Mount Lecheon relative to lightning strikes, it turns out Mount Lecheon is, it's just average. Although from that site, you can look south, northwest, and southwest and see some hot areas. But let's come to thunder now. Let's think about thunder. Here we have thunder, where I'm not used to thinking about thunder, but we're talking about the density of thunder and plotting it in regard to the number of thunderstorm days per year. And guess who's number one? Mount Lecheon. It's the hot point in terms of thunder within the Peloponnese, which we think adds to the conclusion, at least the hypothesis, that a profitable way to go and trying to determine the long sustained occupation of the site or the visiting of the site over a long period of time probably relates to the psychology and the visceral experiences that people had on that mountain. So with that, I'll call it quits. My conclusion, Mount Lecheon is quite a place. There's something there for everyone. And I thank David and Mary for bringing me on as a geologist. It's been life-changing. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, George. We have time for questions, and I would like to start by asking if there are any students who have questions for George. So please raise your hand and I'll come around with this microphone.
As you're about to raise your hand, how many people here have been to Mount Lecheon? Who's working on Mount Lecheon? Yeah. Thank you.
Fair bit. Questions? Questions for George? Student question right there.
Okay. Thank you, George. My name is Joseph, and I'm a grad student with the Geoscience department. I was just curious about the thickness of the limestone and how it serves the springs. So you mentioned when you were digging the ash altar at the top, after a couple of meters, you quickly hit bedrock. But the spring is much further down deep. And then just above the fault, you mentioned that the water seeps through the limestone layers till it hits the impermeable fault. So just thinking, is there limestone layers beneath the bedrock which you hit at the top of the ash altar, How does it really work? I'm
Yes.
kind of confused about it.
Yeah. So right on the ash alder, there's a thin bedded limestone that fractures in a way that the weathered material, eroded material looks like cinder blocks. It's a very regular pattern. So I think water could seep through that very well. Then you go down into a sandstone that's highly fractured. And that fractured sandstone typically is just barely above the spring location. And then once you go down below the sandstone, you're into what are called radiolarian cherts, these beautiful ribbon cherts that fold up nicely. But when faulting took place, the chert layers, which are hard but jointed, they are interbedded with claystone. And when the faulting took place, we're talking 60 kilometers of transport, it just smeared out. And that's what I think, almost like peanut butter. And I think it's that which is sealing off the water that's descending through the rock units above. You bet.
Maybe another student question, if anyone has a question.
Aton.
Yeah, I can get the microphone up.
Nice work, George.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if people have done any work on trying to locate where the metals came from that
Oh.
people were using to make tools back in the day.
Yes. It's a really important question. Less than 3 kilometers away from the Mount Lecheon sanctuary, there is ophiolite. There's a lot of ophiolite. That's the closest piece that we have. It's covered with all kinds of vegetation. There's color occasionally, some green color that kind of makes you think, oh, maybe we found it. David just gets excited because it's a huge question about where the copper came from that was utilized, to make the bronze in our general area in Greece. And I've only spent maybe 3 or 4 days hiking around in that area. I don't see any evidence for any mining that's taken place there, but there's work to do, Aton. And I think you could be a hero. Anybody could be a hero if they found a source of copper near Mount Lecheon. Good question.
Let's open it up.
David can comment on this. Hey, ask David the elevation of anything in the world, and he'll tell you.
We did a little bit of work on the ophiolite this summer with 2 scientists from Democritus from Athens, and so we spent 4 days in the ophiolite bed. The beds, there are actually several around Mount Lecheon, but the biggest one is near Lycosura. So we did some work. We've taken some less than fist-sized samples of rock, and these are being analyzed. And Jay Stevens now at Missouri is going to be helping us with this, as is Yannis Basiakos and Eleni Filippaki from Democritus. So we've done 4 days of research on this very recently.
Fabulous.
Okay, let's open it up. Questions for George. We have a couple minutes for
There's
questions.
some lights that could be turned on.
Yeah, I can turn on the lights in a second here.
So this is not a geoarchaeology question, rather a structural.
Okay.
If Africa is pushing under the Peloponnese, then why is it that the Corinthian basin is expanding?
That's a really good question. So we'll picture the African plate moving northward, I think at about 10 millimeters per year. And it dives underneath the south of Crete. And as it dives, it actually does a kind of a canoe paddle stroke. It actually is descending and moving in this direction. And so that particular motion, kinematic motion, draws the overriding plate toward Africa and pulls the proximal part of the Peloponnese and the southern part of the mainland toward Africa. So it's really ironic, isn't it? That as you see movements that appear to be completely compressional, but in the midst of the system, there happens to be a slab that's going down that has a torque on it that causes a force to actually pull. And so it's as if those of us up here are moving in this direction at 20 millimeters per year, and you're going in reverse twice that velocity. Something has to give in the middle. Tension, yeah, tension on top. And the tension is expressed in an individual rock by fractures, but on a grand scale, regional, the tension is accommodated by these normal faults. So the strain energy will build up and up and up, and finally they pop and they go. Yeah, that's sort of the way it works. It's unusual in any science to have a force that's formally described as a sucking force. That's what it is. Tectonic sucking force. There we go. You heard it here. Yeah,
Andy.
George, that was fascinating. I curious on the Gulf of Corinth question, following up on that, the bridge that you showed us a picture of, how much expansion have they baked into the construction of that bridge? How many years do they have
Yeah,
hardwired into that thing?
I'm recollecting around 75. David, do you happen to know? I think it's on the order of I'll say it's 75 years or so. And then they'll have to break out the slinkies, you know, put in a few more. Isn't that fascinating though? It's incredible. We were there when it opened. Shiba Ganguly.
Have you been able to reconstruct the thickness of the thrush faulted block? How thick it is?
How thick of which block?
The thrush faulted.
Yeah, I think we're not able to do it there because we only have the single fault. But across the Peloponnese and north of the Gulf of Corinth, there's some very detailed cross sections that show duplex after duplex after duplex, and each of those duplex blocks, it's made up of a number of formations, is probably on the order of 400 meters thick. They're not all that huge, but there are 20 or 30 of them, and they all proceed in the same direction.
I would expect what happened. One of the fundamental reasons of high temperature metamorphism is thrush faulting, because it hits up the footwall side of the rock, because you are bringing in hot material and depositing that. And so you have a sawtooth structure initially. So it hits up the footwall side of the rock. And that's what leads to the granulite facies metamorphism. Otherwise, you will not have granulite facies without thrush fault.
Yeah, that's good.
So in this case, do you see any signature of the footwall rock being heated up?
No,
No?
none.
These are all limestone, right?
Yeah, it's very cool. What you have throughout the main limestone, the thick white limestone beds, it's a museum of stylolites, tectonic stylolites and compactional stylolites. It's unbelievable. Never seen anything like it. Those are semi-brittle structures and nothing that suggests any kind of metamorphism or heating up.
And so that means the radioactive heat content of the initial radioactivity, the material concentration was very low. Otherwise, normally, if it is a metapelite, with that thickness, you will have a lot of radioactivity and a lot of heat generation there.
This is GBA in action. An example of what you're saying is I sent off some calcite veins that are associated with the stylites, and to see if uranium analysis could be done to get the age. They're depleted. They're very low uranium content.
Very much for the talk. Very interesting. In the Eastern Mediterranean, there are recently discovered deposits under the sea, like Leviathan of natural gas, and they start exploration there. So do you think as a geologist, do you think it's advisable in that area to drill?
To drill?
Yes.
Drill, baby, drill. I don't think it's advisable. If I were on the stage last night, I would say, I don't think it's advisable.
I recall you talking about the ophelites. It was like 3 kilometers away. Oh, I recall you talking about there being ophelites. There was 3 kilometers from that.
Yes.
I guess when I was there, I didn't realize it was a bunch of thrust faults. So how far do you think the ophelites originated from?
Yeah. Do you work on Mount Lecheon?
No, I decided to come here instead of doing that.
Okay. Oh, geology. You got to talk to him. No, here's the interesting thing, I believe. I showed a stratigraphic column that I described as what? Orange, brown, green, and so on. I could have added another layer below it, but I didn't because it's not in the immediate sanctuary. But there's a layer beneath all of that, which is the ophiolite. So the ophiolite is part of the overall regional stratigraphic section. It's Jurassic in age. The radiolayer cherts are Jurassic and early Cretaceous in age. So that's kind of the basement on which the rest of the stratigraphy is located. And so it's not like a Pluton or something like that. It's a mappable thick layer that just doesn't happen to be exposed right in the sanctuary proper. Yes.
George, this is Chad with AZGS, and forgive the pun, but this talk was enlightening. So thank you.
I love it. I love it.
And I just wanted to ask, given the long timing of occupation and or visitation and the highly active normal faults, have you considered the possibility of people there who might have known this area really well having noticed a scarp form and potentially relate that to the earthquake event?
Yeah. Well, it's really on target. I mean, in my mind's eye, with this unfathomable time period of people coming and going, it's not ridiculous to think that, well, it's easy to say that they felt earthquakes on the top, but it's not ridiculous to think that maybe they're up there sacrificing animals and there was either slip on a fault nearby or clearly mass wasting and landslides on the far side of the mountain. And that would just stoke up the sense of power and I love the way you said the occupation or the visitation frequency. That is such a fundamental question. And I don't think we know that. What season did they come in and how often did they come in? Is it like the Olympic Games where you come in every 2 years or 4 years? But what was it like before, say, 600 BC when there were no big games at Lykaion, but they were still coming there for other purposes? So the timing of things is really, really important.
Kind of like Chaco Canyon, similar mystery.
Chaco Canyon.
We have time for maybe one more question after this.
George, you mentioned the ophiolites.
I did.
Setting of magnetic domains from lightning strikes in that?
So I haven't. Lightning strikes on ophiolite would create a resetting of magnetite. Now, that's a study that needs to be done even right on the top of the mountain. That is to use paleomag to try to figure out were there fires, lightning strikes, what is the focus or the locus of that activity? This guy, Dick Jones, comes to every Thursday colloquium. You need to come meet him. Economic geologist, world traveler, old fossil. He volunteers. Old fossil. And how many degrees do you have from here? 2 degrees. He's a 2-degree man.
And everyone is welcome every Thursday. Just saying, all of you guys are welcome. One more question, perhaps. Let me ask one, George.
Okay.
Has anyone explored speleothems to try and figure out the rainfall variability 3,000 years ago? Because there's limestone, there's faulting, it's the perfect ingredients.
Oh man, I love it.
AKA, can I come to Greece? And
you can come to Greece. So let me describe this to you. On the east side of the mountain, there is terrain that is hummocky and blocky, and you look over edges and it goes straight down, and there's a bench, and then it goes straight down, and there's fissures that you have to walk around. And in those fissures, you look in and you think you're looking at honeycomb bees' nests and so on. but there's some kind of a speleothem, and there's a bunch of them there. And some of them are in masses like this. It would be really interesting.
Let's talk.
Let's talk. Let's talk. So in the announcement, didn't I say, when we're at our best, we learn from one another, right? And I think that's why it's so important in this big research university to come together, not only in the colloquia, get some of these undergraduates to come in so they feel like a part of the department. And my final pitch is to thank all of those who have Zoomed in.
We had 50 people zooming in.
I've had some great email correspondence with alumni, some that I haven't talked to for years, and they're doing great work. One of them wrote in and said, I want to give some money to this department, but I haven't been contacted, since I graduated in '67, And so this is another reason why we should have general talks and bring people together.
So with that, please, a final round of applause for Professor George Davis.
Thank you for coming.
And once again, thanks to all of you for showing up. We really appreciate it. Thank you.